Story number 1.
The fire had been raging for days. It had started as a small spark in the dry brush on the other side of the ridge, but it had quickly grown into a monster, consuming everything in its path. The air was thick with smoke, and the sun, once a bright golden disk, was now a hazy red circle in the sky. The heat was unbearable, and the distant sound of the flames crackling in the distance was like a constant roar, like the earth itself was on fire. Hannah had been living on the old family ranch for the past few years, taking care of the animals and the property while her parents had moved to the city. They had insisted she leave too, but she wouldn't. The ranch had been in the family for generations, and she wasn't about to leave it behind. Now, as the fire crept closer and closer, she regretted that decision more than anything. The roads were blocked, the fire had spread too far for them to get out, and she was stuck here. She stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, staring out at the horizon. The wind was picking up, pushing the smoke and ash in her direction. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Hannah shivered, even though the heat was oppressive. There was something about the stillness that made her uneasy, something about the way the world seemed to hold its breath. She had been hearing things, strange sounds that didn't belong. At night, she'd hear footsteps outside the house, faint creaks in the floorboards, and the sound of whispers on the wind. She had dismissed it at first, blaming it on the stress of the fire, but it was starting to feel different, like something or someone was trying to reach out to her. That afternoon, the wind had shifted. The smoke from the fire was no longer just a distant cloud in the sky. It was right above her, thick and suffocating. She could feel the heat from the flames even though they were still miles away. The air was so thick now that it was hard to breathe. Hannah stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. She could still hear the distant crackle of the fire, but now there was something else, a low murmur, like voices calling to her from the other side of the house. She froze. The voices weren't just in her head, they were real. Someone or something was outside. Heart racing, she grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and made her way to the front door. She peered out the window, scanning the yard. It was impossible to see much with the smoke hanging so thick in the air, but she could make out shadows moving across the property, moving in and out of sight as the wind whipped through the trees. Hannah stepped outside cautiously, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the smoke burned her eyes. She moved toward the barn, the only structure on the property that might offer some shelter if the fire got too close. As she neared the barn, the sound of the wind howling through the trees was almost deafening. It felt like the earth itself was shaking. And then she heard it again. The voices. This time they were clearer, almost as if they were right behind her. A woman's voice, soft and pleading, calling her name. Hannah! Hannah spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was no one there. The yard was empty, save for the flickering shadows cast by the smoke. She took a step backward, and then another, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to be out here for much longer. The fire was getting closer. But as she turned to go back to the house, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the smoke, just beyond the barn, she saw a figure, a person, a woman dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned gown, her long hair blowing in the wind. She was standing still, just outside the barn, staring at Hannah with wide, vacant eyes. The woman's face was pale, and there was something about her, something wrong about the way she stood there, as if she wasn't fully real, as if she was made of smoke and shadow. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run back into the house, but her legs wouldn't move. The woman took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving Hannah's. Hannah! The voice came again. But this time it was softer, almost like a whisper. You shouldn't be here. Hannah took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. The woman took another step forward, her form becoming clearer, more solid. Hannah could see her now. Her face was thin, gaunt, like a woman who had been lost to time, someone who had not seen the light of day in years. She was pale, her skin almost translucent, her hair long and wild like it hadn't been cut in decades. The dress she wore was faded and tattered, as if it had been passed down through generations. The woman's eyes were wide, her pupils dilated, staring at Hannah with an intensity that made her feel like she was being swallowed whole. Hannah couldn't move. She wanted to run, but her body was frozen in place. The woman's mouth opened, but instead of words, there was only a terrible, guttural sound. A scream, but one that was muffled, distorted, as though it was trapped inside the very air itself. The smoke seemed to swirl around the woman, her form becoming more and more translucent with every passing second. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman vanished. The smoke closed in around her, and there was nothing left but the thick haze and the distant roar of the fire. Hannah stood there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands trembling as she clutched the flashlight. She didn't know what had just happened. Had it been real? Had she imagined it? There was no time to think about it now. The fire was getting closer, and there was nothing left for her to do but escape. She turned and ran back to the house, her legs burning as she sprinted across the yard. The fire was closing in on them, and the wind was pushing the smoke harder, the air becoming even more suffocating. She needed to get out, to get to safety. But as she reached the door of the house, she heard something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A soft whisper coming from behind her. "Hannah?" She spun around, flashlight trembling in her hand. The yard was empty. There was nothing there. But deep in her chest, she knew something was watching her. The fire was at the edge of the property now. She had no choice but to leave, to run. Her family would understand. They had to. Hannah grabbed her things and ran, never looking back. The fire was moving fast, but she knew there was something worse out there. Something that had been waiting for her. The road was blocked by flames, but she managed to find an old fire break that led down to the creek. It was her only chance. She ran for what felt like hours, not stopping until she reached the safety of the river. The air was still thick with smoke, and the fire was still raging in the distance, but she was far enough away now. As she stood there gasping for breath, she looked back toward the ranch. The smoke was rising high into the sky, and in the distance she saw the faint outline of the old farmhouse, just barely visible through the haze. She couldn't see it clearly, but for a brief moment she thought she saw something else, another figure standing in the smoke. She couldn't be sure, but she knew one thing. She would never go back. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The fire had been coming for days. What started as a minor flare-up in the dry underbrush had grown quickly, fanned by winds that had no intention of stopping. Everyone in the town had received the warning early in the week. Evacuation notices were sent out, and the highway was packed with cars trying to escape the encroaching flames. But Karen had stayed. She couldn't leave her family's property. It had been in her family for over a century, passed down through generations. Her father had died just a year before, and the house they lived in, an old farmhouse nestled in a valley, felt like the last part of him that she could still hold on to. The wildfire was a monstrous thing, swallowing up thousands of acres. But Karen wasn't ready to let go, even when the flames had started to creep closer, their orange glow lighting up the sky in the late afternoon. She wasn't sure if she should have stayed, though. That morning, something had felt off. The air felt heavier than usual. The smoke was thick, hanging in the air like a fog, and the wind had shifted direction, pushing the fire toward them. She could already see the flames from the porch, rising over the hills in the distance. "Karen," her mother had said earlier, "we need to go. This isn't safe." But Karen had refused. She couldn't bring herself to leave. Now it was getting too late to go anywhere. It was late evening when the power went out. The house left in darkness, except for the faint orange glow from the distant fire. Karen sat in the living room, staring at the flickering light from a candle she had lit. The sound of the wind howling outside was unnerving, but she had grown used to it. It wasn't the wind that had her on edge, though. It was something else. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure in the kitchen. She froze. For a moment, she thought it was her mother, maybe coming to check on her. But then the figure vanished, just like that. She blinked. Nothing. Just shadows in the corners of the room. The candle flickered again. Her heart raced. "Mom?" she called out, her voice shaking. No response. She stood up, moving carefully toward the kitchen, but the room was empty. The door to the back porch was slightly ajar, the hinges creaking as the wind blew through. She shut it, locking it tightly, and turned back toward the living room. The house seemed to be groaning under the pressure of the storm, the walls creaking and shifting with every gust of wind. But there was something else now, something she couldn't place. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. "Mom?" She called again, a little louder this time, but no response came. She stepped into the hallway, moving toward her mother's room. As she walked past the door to the attic, she hesitated. The attic was always locked. Her father had always made sure of that, and since his passing, Karen hadn't dared open it. There were rumors about that attic, rumors that her father had always dismissed as nonsense. But Karen remembered the stories from when she was a child. People said it was haunted, that something in that attic had been left behind after the last of her ancestors had passed. The house had been in her family for so long, but no one ever talked about what had happened in the attic. It was as if it were a forbidden place. Karen's footsteps slowed as she stood in front of the door. Her heart thudded in her chest, and her hand shook as it rested on the doorknob. What was she thinking? She should leave it alone, but the curiosity gnawed at her, a sharp pang in the pit of her stomach. She turned the knob. The door creaked open, and the smell of old wood and dust hit her like a wall. The attic was dark, and she couldn't see much, but she heard something, a soft shuffling sound, like footsteps on the wooden floor. "Mom?" she called, but her voice sounded weak, strained. The wind outside howled louder, pushing the door open wider. With a quick breath, Karen stepped inside. The air was thick with dust. The shadows in the attic seemed to stretch longer than they should have, and the darkness beyond the faint light from the hall seemed to swallow everything. She could hear the fire in the distance, the crackling of flames eating up the land, but something else was here now. A sound that wasn't the wind. It was a whisper. She paused, listening carefully. The whisper was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was a voice. Karen. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned her head toward the corner of the attic, where a large wooden trunk sat, covered in dust and cobwebs. The whisper came again. "Karen, help!" Something stirred in her chest, like an icy hand clutching her heart. Her mind was racing. Her father had always told her to never go up into the attic. He had warned her, even before his passing. But now it was like a force was pulling her toward that trunk, something beyond her control. She took a step forward, her feet heavy. The whisper grew louder with each step. "Please." Her pulse pounded in her ears as she approached the trunk. She knelt down and slowly lifted the heavy lid. The sound of old wood groaning was the only thing she could hear, and then she stopped. There, inside the trunk, was a bundle of old clothing, wrapped in what looked like a faded quilt. As she pulled it out, something fell from the folds of the cloth, a small yellowed photograph. Karen picked it up, her hands trembling. It was an old picture, black and white, of a woman standing outside the very house she lived in. The woman looked strikingly similar to her, with the same dark eyes and brown hair, but it was the date on the back that made her freeze. 1915. The voice came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. "Karen?" She turned around, but no one was there. The attic was empty. Only the shadows seemed to move, twisting and curling as if they were alive. Her heart pounded in her chest. The fire was getting closer, the smoke thicker, and the wind howling like a beast. But it wasn't just the fire she feared anymore. The whispers had filled the room, swirling around her, pressing in on her like they were suffocating her. "Who are you?" Karen asked aloud, though her voice was barely above a whisper. The air seemed to shift around her, heavy and thick with something she couldn't see. The shadows in the attic grew darker, closer. "Help!" Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, and Karen was plunged into complete darkness. The whispers were louder now, ringing in her ears, filling the space like an endless echo. She couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. She stumbled backward, falling to the floor, the photograph slipping from her hands. The temperature dropped sharply, and her breath turned to mist in the cold air. In the dark, she could hear the faint sound of footsteps, the creak of floorboards, as if someone or something was walking toward her. And then a voice, soft but clear, whispered in her ear. "Run." She didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She just ran. The door to the attic flew open on its own as she bolted down the stairs. The house groaned and creaked like it was alive, but she didn't stop. She ran to the front door and flung it open, not looking back. The fire was only a few miles away now, the sky a sickly orange, and the heat was suffocating. But as Karen stepped outside, she knew she wasn't alone. Something was still with her, just beyond her sight. But she could feel it. She could feel the weight of the presence, the pull of the past. The whispers were gone, but she could still hear them in the distance. Karen. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The fire was close, but there was something worse on the wind now. A history that had been buried, a presence that had never left. And no matter how far she ran, Karen knew she would never truly escape. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
The wildfire had been roaring through the valley for days. A hot wind carried the smoke like a blanket across the landscape, and the sky had turned an unsettling shade of orange. The firemen were stretched thin, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning trees and brush. Molly had been warned to evacuate, but she had refused. The ranch was all she had left after her husband Ben passed away. It was their dream, their life, and no fire was going to take that away from her. She had spent the last few days preparing her home, moving what she could into the truck, but something kept her here. Maybe it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the lingering feeling that Ben would never want her to leave. The ranch had been in his family for generations, and he had fought for it with everything he had. Molly wasn't about to give up on it now, no matter how close the fire seemed to be. As dusk fell on the 4th day of the fire, Molly sat on the porch, staring out at the horizon. The sun was hidden behind a thick curtain of smoke, and the only light came from the flickering glow of the fire off in the distance. It felt surreal, like she was watching a nightmare unfold from a distance, as though it wasn't real. Suddenly, a gust of wind kicked up, making the trees shake violently. A chill ran down her spine, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She had been hearing things, faint whispers carried on the wind, but every time she tried to focus on them, they disappeared. Molly, she thought she heard. Her name. She stood up quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked around the yard, but there was no one. The wind continued to howl, but no voices. Just the crackling of the fire in the distance. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. The fire and the smoke were messing with her mind. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Molly, help me." She turned around, her pulse racing. The voice was unmistakable. It was Ben's. It sounded like him, just like the way he used to call her when they worked together on the ranch. He had a way of saying her name that always made her feel safe, always made her feel like everything would be okay. "Molly?" The voice came again, but this time it was coming from behind the barn near the old well. She felt a lump form in her throat, and she couldn't move. She should have called out to the firefighters. She should have evacuated when she had the chance. But now, there was no turning back. Instinctively, she grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the barn. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she moved, and her breath quickened with every step. She told herself that it was just the fire playing tricks on her mind. It had to be. But the closer she got to the barn, the stronger the feeling in her chest grew, a coldness that prickled her skin despite the heat of the fire. When she reached the barn, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. There, by the old well, stood a figure. At first, she thought it was just the smoke playing with her eyes. But no, the figure was solid. A man, dressed in old work clothes. His face was hidden in shadow, but there was something about his posture, the way he stood, rigid, like he was waiting for her. "Molly?" The voice was softer now, almost a whisper, but it was undeniably Ben's voice. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it wasn't possible, but it felt so real. Ben had died in the fire 2 years ago. The fire that had taken him along with their home had been swift and unforgiving. She had barely managed to escape with her life. The ranch had been reduced to ashes, and with it, all of her hopes and dreams. But this figure in the smoke looked just like him. "Ben?" she whispered, barely able to speak. The figure didn't move, but she could feel his presence like a heavy weight in the air. Her body tensed, but she couldn't turn away. "Ben, is it really you?" she asked again, her voice trembling. She stepped forward slowly, cautiously, until she was standing right in front of the figure. And then the wind changed. It kicked up fiercely, and for a split second, the smoke cleared just enough for her to see the man's face. It wasn't Ben. It was someone else, someone she didn't recognize. His eyes were hollow, dark, as if they had seen too much. His face was gaunt, and his skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones. He looked like he had been burned, his features distorted by the fire. Molly's stomach turned. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to escape. The figure remained still, its eyes never leaving hers. "Help me," the voice whispered again, but this time it didn't sound like Ben. It sounded like a plea, a cry for help, and it broke her heart. "Who are you?" Molly asked, though she already knew the answer. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, as the smoke swirled around them both. Molly's breath caught in her throat as a memory flooded her mind. A memory of the old house, the fire, the people she had heard about who had been trapped, people who had died in the blaze, unable to escape. It had been a terrible loss. The whole town had mourned. But in that moment, she realized something. The man before her, the one who resembled a ghost, wasn't just a figment of her imagination. This was one of them, one of the souls lost in the fire, trapped between the world of the living and the dead, forever calling for help. Molly took another step back, feeling the heat of the fire in the distance, the wind growing stronger. It was getting closer. The fire was coming for her. The figure raised its hand, pointing toward the horizon. The flames were growing, their light flickering through the smoke, but Molly couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. She knew what it was trying to tell her. It wanted her to leave, to run. The fire had taken too many. She couldn't become one of them. "Molly," the voice pleaded again, but this time it was softer, almost loving. It sounded like Ben again. "Go. Save yourself." She turned and ran. The wind pushed at her, the air thick with smoke, but she didn't stop. She ran as fast as she could, back toward the house, the truck. She could hear the sound of the figure calling after her, but she didn't look back. When she reached the truck, she jumped inside and started the engine. She didn't wait for the flames to reach her. She didn't wait to see if anyone was still out there. The fire was spreading quickly, and she knew she had no time to waste. As she drove away, the sky behind her lit up with the glow of the fire. She glanced in her rearview mirror and caught a final glimpse of the barn, the silhouette of the figure still standing there, watching her leave. Molly didn't know if she had seen a ghost or if the fire had twisted her mind, but she knew one thing for sure. The fire had taken far too much, and now it was up to her to survive. Story: the end.
Story number 4.
The wildfires had been devastating the area for weeks. The once lush forests, now blackened and smoldering, stretched out beyond the horizon. The evacuation orders came early in the week, but Susan had stayed behind. Her father, who had passed just a year ago, had built their cabin from the ground up. It was small but sturdy, and though the flames were getting closer, Susan couldn't bring herself to leave. The place held too many memories, too many pieces of him. That afternoon, as the smoke thickened and the wind picked up, she heard the first warning of danger, a low hum that grew louder. It was the sound of a fire approaching. Her heart raced in her chest. The fire was heading in their direction, but the evacuation route was already jammed. She had no choice but to hunker down and hope for the best. She paced around the cabin, watching the glow of the fire in the distance. Her only company was her dog, Max, who was unusually quiet, standing by the door and staring into the woods as though something had caught his attention. She tried to brush it off as nerves. Max had always been an anxious dog, especially when storms were nearby. But this felt different. The air was unnaturally still, the crackling of the fire now replaced with a strange silence. She opened the door and stepped outside, feeling the oppressive weight of the smoke. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange light over everything. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next disaster. Max barked suddenly, breaking the stillness, and Susan stepped quickly toward the edge of the woods to see what he was reacting to. Her eyes scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the flickering light of the fire in the distance. Max's barking grew more frantic, and Susan felt an unsettling chill creep down her spine. Then, she heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, just beyond the tree line. Susan, her name was clear, though barely audible, and it sent a wave of dread through her. She whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but there was nothing. No one, just the smoke thick and choking in the air and the wind howling through the trees. "Susan?" The whisper came again, closer this time. Max growled low in his throat and backed away, ears flat against his head. Susan's pulse quickened, but she didn't move. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as a cold breeze swept across her face. "Susan, come inside." It wasn't just the wind. The voice was real, and it was coming from inside the woods. Susan stood frozen. She had heard the stories before. The ones about the cabin being built on old land, the ones about the strange things people had witnessed in these woods long before she moved in. Her father had always dismissed them as superstition, but Susan couldn't help but feel there was some truth to them. "Susan, it's time to come inside." The voice was unmistakably familiar. It was her father's voice. Her heart skipped a beat as the memories of his death, the final days in the hospital, the funeral, it all came rushing back. The pain, the loss. It was as if he were standing right there, just beyond her sight, calling her name. Max whined, pulling away from the door, his body trembling. Susan stepped closer to the edge of the trees, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The flames were growing closer now, but it was as though something was pulling her toward the woods, as though her father's voice was guiding her. "Come inside, Susan," it repeated. "I'm here." Without thinking, Susan took a step forward, then another. The woods loomed dark ahead of her. The smoke was thick now, filling the air with the smell of burning wood, but still she moved toward the voice. Max tugged harder at her side, but she ignored him, compelled by something she couldn't explain. The trees parted ahead of her, and she entered a small clearing. In the center, she saw a figure, tall and thin, draped in the smoke. The figure didn't have a clear shape, but Susan could see the outline of a person. She didn't know why, but the first thing that came to her mind was that it was her father. It felt like him. "Dad?" she called out in a voice she barely recognized. The figure didn't respond, but it turned, walking slowly into the thick of the trees. Susan followed without thinking, the air growing colder as she moved deeper into the woods. She couldn't see clearly now. The smoke was so thick it obscured everything. The world felt distant, and for a moment she forgot about the fire, about the danger, about everything except that figure ahead of her. She stumbled, tripping over a root, and when she looked up, the figure was gone. Only the trees and the smoke surrounded her. There was no sound. Nothing. Nothing. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the rustle of leaves in the wind. A sickening feeling crawled up her spine, and she finally realized the mistake she had made. She had followed someone, into the woods, but now she was alone. She was lost. Max barked from a distance, his voice strained and frantic, but Susan couldn't tell where he was. The smoke had grown so dense that it felt like she was walking through a thick fog, disorienting and suffocating. She turned back, trying to retrace her steps, but the path she had taken was gone. The trees seemed to close in on her, and the air grew heavier with each breath she took. And then she heard the whisper again. "Susan, come inside." It was closer now, like the voice was right next to her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. "Dad?" she called again, panic rising in her throat. She ran through the woods, stumbling over roots and rocks, but no matter how fast she moved, the voice seemed to follow her. Finally, she reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, gasping for air. She could see the cabin in the distance, a small speck of light in the growing darkness. She started to walk toward it, then broke into a run. She was almost there when the voice came again, louder this time, as though it were just behind her. "Susan, come inside." Susan turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw a figure standing just at the edge of the woods. The same shape, the same outline. She opened her mouth to scream, but before she could make a sound, the figure was gone. And then, the ground beneath her feet shifted. She fell forward, tumbling to the ground. The world around her spun, and her heart raced as she struggled to get back on her feet. Her vision blurred, and she could taste the smoke in her mouth. The fire was getting closer now, far too close for comfort, and the smoke burned her throat as she gasped for breath. "Max!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. There was a sudden bark from the distance, faint but unmistakable. Max. He was calling her, but there was no time to waste. Susan stumbled to her feet, running as fast as she could toward the cabin. The last thing she heard before she reached the porch was the whisper again. "Susan, it's time to come inside." But there was no one there. The fire was close now, the heat rising as the first embers fell from the sky. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, breathless and trembling. Max was at her side, his fur singed from the smoke, his eyes wide with fear. She sat down on the floor, trying to catch her breath, the weight of what had just happened settling over her. The fire was here, but the real terror had already passed. It wasn't the fire that had nearly consumed her. It was the whisper, the voice that had guided her into the woods, the voice of her father. And she realized then, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that her father had never really left. He had always been there, watching over her, even if it meant leading her into the danger that had nearly consumed them both. As the fire roared in the distance, Susan couldn't help but wonder if the voice had been trying to guide her out, not in, trying to save her. But it was too late now. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The fire had started small, a small spark from the dry underbrush in the hills. It was nothing unusual for this time of year, but the wind was fierce, and soon it was a raging inferno. The town had evacuated, but Claire hadn't. The house had been in her family for generations, and the thought of leaving it behind was unbearable. Her father had always told her the land would protect them, that no matter what, the house would stand. Now, with flames licking at the edges of the property, she wasn't so sure. It was late in the afternoon when she felt the first shift in the air. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning wood. The sky was thick with smoke, and the sun was just a faint disk through the haze. Claire stood on the porch of the old farmhouse, watching the fire in the distance. The red-orange glow was unsettling, but it was the quiet that unnerved her. The town was usually filled with the sounds of wildlife, distant chatter, children playing in the streets, but now everything was silent. The only sound was the crackling of the flames as they devoured everything in their path. Max, her dog, was lying at her feet, his head resting between his paws, but his ears were perked up, and he kept looking toward the woods. Claire could feel it too, an unease in the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She turned her back to the fire and walked into the house, closing the door behind her. It was cooler inside, but the stillness felt unnatural. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick slower, as though time itself had been affected by the approaching flames. She moved through the living room, the family portraits on the wall watching her, their faces frozen in time. The house was filled with memories, her parents, her grandparents, and before them, her great-grandparents. Her fingers brushed against the old piano in the corner. It had been her mother's, and it had sat there for as long as she could remember. The sound of it had always been comforting, a piece of her past that never changed. But now, as she reached for the keys, something else caught her attention. A voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it came from the direction of the kitchen. "Claire." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Max stood up suddenly, growling low in his chest, his body tense. Claire stood perfectly still, listening. It was her name. But who had called her? "Claire." The voice came again, clearer now, and it sounded familiar. It was her father's voice. Her heart raced, and she turned toward the kitchen, but no one was there. The air in the room felt colder, the shadows darker than they should be. She felt a chill run through her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Max's growling deepened, and he moved toward the door, pawing at it insistently. "Claire, come," the voice called again. Without thinking, Claire crossed the room, opened the kitchen door, and stepped into the hall. The house was quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She passed the door to the basement, which was always locked, but today it was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. The door creaked as it opened, revealing the pitch-black darkness beyond. Claire hesitated, but then she heard the voice again, this time from the basement. "Come down." Her heart pounded in her chest as she made her way down the narrow wooden steps. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to press in on her. The wooden beams above creaked, and the faint scent of something old and musty filled the space. It was the same feeling she'd had as a child when her father would tell her not to go into the basement. "There's nothing for you down there," he'd say. But now, as an adult, the urge to investigate was stronger than any caution. She had to know. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the air felt thick, like it was alive, pressing against her. She reached out for the light switch, but stopped short. There, in the corner of the basement, was an old trunk. It was a large, weathered thing covered in dust and cobwebs. Claire had never seen it before, but something about it felt familiar. The voice came again, softer this time. Open it. She could feel her father's presence, as though he were standing behind her, urging her on. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she touched the lid of the trunk. With a soft groan, it creaked open, and she gasped. Inside was an old photograph, framed and worn with age. She reached for it, her heart in her throat. It was a picture of her father as a young man, standing in front of the house, smiling. But there was something else in the photo, something she hadn't noticed before. Standing behind her father in the shadows was a figure, a woman. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her eyes, those eyes were clear. They were the same eyes that Claire saw in the mirror every day. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the photo. The woman in the picture looked so familiar, but Claire couldn't place her. It was as if the face had been buried in her memory, waiting to be uncovered. Suddenly the air shifted again. The temperature dropped sharply and the voice came one more time, this time cold and sharp. Claire, you need to leave. Claire snapped her head up, heart racing. The shadows in the basement seemed to deepen and she felt an overwhelming urge to run. But before she could move, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Slow, steady. She spun around, but the basement was empty. Max's frantic barking echoed from upstairs. Claire turned and sprinted up the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. She reached the top, but before she could get to the door, it slammed shut. She tried to twist the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The house felt like it was alive, the walls pressing in on her, the floor beneath her feet trembling. Claire, the voice was right behind her now, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Nothing except the oppressive silence, the thudding of her own heart in her chest. With all her strength, she shoved the door open, and the house groaned as though it were protesting. She burst into the living room and grabbed Max, who was still barking wildly. Her mind raced as she ran toward the back door, but the smoke had thickened outside. The fire was closer now. Too close. And yet, as she stood there staring at the flames in the distance, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The voice, her father's voice, was still with her, but now it was distant, fading into the wind. Go, Claire, the voice whispered one last time. Go. She didn't need to be told again. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, Max at her heels, and didn't look back. The fire was nearing, but she could still feel her father's presence, guiding her, protecting her. The land had kept its promise, after all. As she made her way toward the evacuation route, the heat of the fire behind her, she realized that the house wasn't just her father's. It was hers now, too. His voice, his presence would always be with her, no matter where she went. And in that moment, she knew that she was not alone. Not in the fire. Not in the world. She carried her father with her, and he would protect her, just as he had promised. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The fire was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. Smoke billowed across the valley, turning the sky a sickly orange. Mia could see the flames licking at the trees in the distance, crawling steadily toward the small cabin she had called home for the past 5 years. She had packed the essentials, a few clothes, the family photos, and some tools she might need if she was forced to leave. But she didn't want to leave. The idea of abandoning her home, the place she had shared with her husband Caleb, was unbearable. It had been 3 months since Caleb had passed away in a tragic car accident. The grief still gnawed at her, a constant ache in her chest. The cabin, their dream, now felt like a weight she couldn't escape. But she had stayed. She had to stay. Caleb had loved this place, and in a way, Mia felt closer to him here than anywhere else. She could hear the crackling of the fire in the distance, but the sounds from the forest were strange tonight. The wind, which had been relentless all day, had died down. The eerie quiet made her uneasy. The fire wasn't just the land that had been scorched. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. Mia stood on the porch, staring into the distance. Her hands gripped the railing, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She was alone. At least that's what she thought. The temperature had risen, and she could feel the air getting thicker as the flames approached. Then suddenly she heard it, a sound so faint she almost convinced herself she hadn't heard anything at all. Mia. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the crackling of the fire, it was a voice. Mia. The voice was soft, familiar, but she couldn't place it. It sounded like Caleb, but Caleb had died months ago. The rational part of her brain told her it was impossible, but the part that still clung to the memories of their life together, the laughter, the small moments, whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, he had come back to her. Mia. The voice came again, clearer now, as if it were right behind her. She whipped around, her pulse racing, but there was no one there. The porch was empty, the yard bare. She stepped away from the railing, her heart pounding. It had to be the wind, she told herself. But the voice, she was sure it had been Caleb's. She felt it in her bones, like his presence was wrapped around her. He had always called her name that way, softly but urgently. Mia, you need to go, the voice called again. This time, the voice was stronger, insistent. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Mia turned back toward the house. There was no way she could leave. The fire was coming. Yes, but she wasn't sure if she could survive leaving her home behind. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. But the voice came again, louder now, and she swore she could feel it physically, as though it were shaking her very core. Mia, please, go. She stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. A cold chill washed over her despite the heat in the air. She had to get out of here. She grabbed her bag, clutching it to her chest as if it could protect her from whatever was happening. Her feet moved of their own accord, almost as if something was pulling her toward the truck. She had to leave. As she made her way toward the vehicle, she glanced back at the cabin one last time. The fire was closer now, its light flickering in the distance. But there, at the edge of the porch, stood a figure. It wasn't Caleb, but it was someone she recognized. Her mother. Mia froze. Her mother had passed away a year before Caleb. It had been a quiet death, just as her mother had wanted, but the grief still weighed on Mia's heart. She had always felt that her mother's spirit lingered around the cabin, watching over her as if it were her mother's love that had kept the place intact through all the years. Mia, her mother's voice was gentle, the same as when Mia was a little girl. You have to go now. You don't belong here anymore. Tears sprang to Mia's eyes, her throat tightened. Mom? Her voice cracked as she spoke. The figure, her mother, smiled sadly. It's not safe. You need to leave before it's too late. The smoke was so thick now that it stung her eyes, making it hard to see. She felt a strong pull, an overwhelming sense of urgency. The fire was closer, the heat intense, but the voice of her mother, who had always been the steady one, made her hesitate. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to let go of everything she had worked for, everything Caleb and she had built together. But the image of her mother standing there, surrounded by the smoke, was enough to break her resolve. The fire was coming, and if she stayed, she might not make it out. Without a word, Mia turned and sprinted for the truck. She barely made it into the driver's seat before the sky overhead turned a fiery red. The flames were closing in. As she started the engine, she glanced once more at the cabin. The figure of her mother was gone, but the weight of her presence remained, as if she had been there all along, guiding her. The road was winding and treacherous, but Mia drove with a determination she didn't know she had. The fire was fast, but so was she. It wasn't until she reached the main road, safe in the distance from the fire, that she finally allowed herself to breathe. The weight of the moment lifted as the heat faded, replaced by the cool night air. But something deep inside her, something primal, whispered that she had been right to leave. Her mother had warned her, had shown her the way. She had escaped. As she glanced into the rearview mirror, Mia thought she saw a shadow standing near the edge of the road, watching her drive away. She didn't stop. She couldn't. But in that moment, she knew. Whatever had been left behind, whatever had been calling to her, had given her the strength to survive. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The wildfire was relentless. For days it had been eating through the dry hills, spreading quickly with the winds, devouring everything in its path. Lauren stood at the edge of the property, watching the smoke billow into the sky, feeling the heat even from a distance. She had seen this before. Wildfires were common in this part of California, but this one was different. The fire was aggressive, too fast, and it was close. Her phone had buzzed with evacuation alerts for the past 2 days, but Lauren refused to leave. She couldn't. Not yet. The family ranch had been passed down for generations, and though she was the last of her bloodline, she couldn't let it go without a fight. Her parents had passed away years ago, and she had been living alone on the land, trying to keep things going. It was hard work, but it was worth it, especially when she could still feel her parents' presence in every room of the house, every corner of the barn. She grabbed her jacket, though the air was warm, and started walking toward the old barn. There was a sick feeling in her stomach. The wind had shifted, pushing the fire closer. The sky had darkened, a thick veil of smoke blotting out the sun, leaving everything in an eerie twilight. It felt wrong, but she couldn't leave. As she reached the barn, she paused, listening. There was a crackling sound, but it wasn't the fire. It came from the far corner of the barn where her father's old tools hung. She had been meaning to clear that area out for years. The sound grew louder, like the scraping of metal against wood. Lauren's heart began to race. "Hello?" she called, stepping into the barn. Her voice was shaky, but she tried to sound confident. There was no response. The sound stopped. She stood there, her heart thudding in her chest, staring at the dark corner. She stepped forward, moving cautiously toward where the noise had come from. When she reached the far wall, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her father's old shovel was leaning against the wall, but it was moving, slowly as if being nudged by an unseen hand. Lauren froze, unable to move. It had to be the wind, right? The fire had been whipping up the gusts, but it wasn't the wind. It was too precise. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. The shovel stopped moving, and then, just as she was about to turn and leave, the barn door slammed shut. A chill ran down her spine. The fire was getting closer, the air growing thick with smoke, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the door. It was as if someone, was inside with her. The barn was silent for a moment, and then she heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, so faint she thought she had imagined it. But it came again, this time clearer. Lauren. Her name. The whisper came from behind her, from the farthest corner of the barn. She turned quickly, her pulse racing, but there was no one there. "Dad?" she whispered, almost too quietly for her own ears. She didn't know why she said it. Her father had passed years ago, but she could never shake the feeling that he was still watching over her, still there in the barn, in the house, in the fields. His presence was constant. It was something she had gotten used to, something that comforted her. "Dad, is that you?" she asked, louder this time. No answer. Then she heard something else, a soft, creaking sound, like footsteps on the old wooden floorboards. It was faint, but it was there. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and she instinctively took a step back, her hand reaching for the door handle. She needed to get out. But before she could make a move, a shadow darted across the barn. It was quick, just a flicker, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. She squinted into the dark corners, trying to make out any figure, but there was nothing. The barn was empty. The wind outside howled, rattling the walls, but then the whisper came again. Closer this time. "Lauren, don't leave." It wasn't her father's voice. This voice was softer, like a child's, trembling with fear. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. She turned to face the corner where the voice seemed to be coming from, and there, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was too dark to make out the details, but she could see the outline of a person, a child. Her heart pounded as she took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under her weight. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice trembling now. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it just stood there, unmoving, staring at her. "Please, don't go," the voice said again, this time desperate. Lauren felt her stomach churn. Her mind raced. The figure couldn't have been real. Could it? It had to be some sort of hallucination, something caused by the fire, the smoke, the stress. But then the figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows, and Lauren's breath caught in her throat. It was a girl, barely older than 5 or 6, with dark, wild hair that seemed to shimmer in the low light. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes wide and full of sorrow. Her clothes were ragged, covered in soot and dirt like she had been in a fire long ago. Lauren took a step back, her heart racing in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper. The girl didn't speak, but she reached out her hand toward Lauren, her fingers trembling. "Please, don't leave me alone," the girl whispered, her voice a heartbreaking plea. A sharp pain pierced Lauren's chest. The girl's eyes were pleading, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. She didn't know why, but Lauren felt an overwhelming sense of loss, like she was seeing something far too painful for her to bear. The girl was reaching out, asking for help, asking for comfort. Lauren took a step closer, her hand shaking as she reached out to the girl. "Don't worry. I'm not leaving you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was comforting, herself or the girl. As her fingers brushed against the child's, the barn door slammed open with a deafening crash. Lauren gasped, stumbling backward, and when she turned to look, the girl was gone, vanished into thin air, as if she had never been there at all. The barn was silent again, but Lauren's heart was still pounding in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The fire was closer now. She could feel the heat creeping through the walls. She had to leave. But before she could move, the door slammed shut again. The whisper came one last time, softer than ever, almost drowned out by the roar of the fire. "Thank you." And just like that, the barn went still. The air felt thick, the smoke clouding her vision, but she didn't hesitate this time. She turned and ran, not looking back. She didn't stop until she reached the truck. The fire was on her heels, but she didn't care. She knew deep down that she had been called to that barn for a reason. Whatever had been there, whatever had reached out to her, she had done what it needed. It was time to go. Time to let go of the past. And as she drove away, Lauren couldn't help but feel that, somehow, the ghost of the child had finally found peace. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The air had already begun to feel thick and suffocating. The sky an oppressive shade of orange as flames crept along the dry hillsides. For days, the wildfire had raged across the mountainside, consuming everything in its path. The smell of burning wood and pine had grown so familiar that it was almost unbearable. In the midst of it all, there was a small cabin tucked away in the woods that, hidden beneath the dark silhouettes of trees that had long since lost their green hue to the fire. Maggie and her son Jake had been preparing for the worst. They had seen the smoke billow in the distance days ago and had packed their things, ready to leave at a moment's notice. But as the fire grew closer, there was no way to get out. The roads had become impassable, and the thick smoke made it nearly impossible to breathe, let alone drive. The evacuation orders had come too late. Now, Maggie sat by the window, her heart heavy with anxiety. She had always loved this cabin, the isolation, the peace it offered, but now it felt like a tomb. The fire was no longer a distant threat. It was right there, closing in. Jake sat beside her, his head resting against her shoulder. The sound of the wind howling through the trees outside, mixed with the crackling of the flames, was deafening. Every now and then, a distant rumble of thunder would add to the oppressive noise. There was no way to tell if it was an actual storm or just the fire's roar as it devoured everything in its path. Suddenly, Jake spoke, his voice trembling. "Mom, what's that?" Maggie looked down at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. He was pointing toward the back of the cabin, where the woods had once been lush and green. Now the trees were bare, charred remnants standing like twisted sentinels. The fire had yet to reach this part of the forest, but it was getting closer with each passing moment. Maggie stood up, her pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" Jake's finger trembled as he pointed again. "I saw someone, just standing there." Maggie followed his gaze, her eyes scanning the darkness. She saw nothing but the smoky haze and the outlines of burned trees. The wind had picked up again, sending ash swirling through the air like snowflakes. She shook her head. "Jake, it's just the smoke playing tricks on you," she said softly, trying to comfort him. "The fire is messing with our heads. We're okay, all right?" But Jake didn't seem convinced. He stared out into the darkness, his wide eyes filled with fear. "No, Mom, I saw them. They were right there. They were watching us." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She took a step closer to the window, trying to peer through the smoky haze. Nothing moved, and the faint orange glow of the fire cast eerie shadows across the landscape. She swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest. "Mom, it was a man. He was wearing a coat, but he looked wrong. His face was dark, like it was burned. Jake whispered. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. It's okay, Jake. There's no one out there. You're just scared, sweetheart. We've been through a lot. It's natural to see things that aren't really there. Jake shook his head stubbornly. I'm not imagining it, Mom. He was there. He's still there. A knot tightened in Maggie's stomach. She knelt down beside her son, cupping his face in her hands. I need you to listen to me. We need to stay calm. We'll be all right. The fire won't get us, I promise. But Jake's eyes were fixed on something beyond her. His breath came in short gasps, his face pale with fear. He's getting closer. Maggie's blood ran cold. She stood up quickly, heart pounding in her chest. She moved to the door and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was hot and thick with smoke, the scent of burning wood stinging her nose. Her eyes scanned the darkened landscape, but there was nothing, no movement, just the crackling of the fire in the distance. But Jake's voice came again, weak and shaking. He's right behind you. Maggie froze, her breath caught in her throat. She spun around quickly, her eyes darting to the back of the cabin. Nothing. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she stepped back into the cabin, closing the door behind her. Jake was huddled in the corner, his eyes wide with terror. Mom, he's here. He's in the house. Maggie's mind raced. She knew there was no one else here. There couldn't be. The isolation of the cabin meant they hadn't seen a soul for days. But the look in Jake's eyes, the absolute conviction in his voice, it was enough to make her doubt herself. Jake, listen to me, she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. There's no one here. We're alone. We're safe. I'll protect you, I swear. But as she said the words, something caught her eye. A shadow, fleeting and dark, moved across the doorway. She whipped her head around, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her throat went dry. Her instinct told her to run, to get away from this place. But the fire was too close, and the roads were impassable. She was trapped. Then she heard it. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was a whisper, so faint at first that she wasn't sure she'd heard it at all. But then it grew louder, clearer. A voice, rasping and unnatural, croaked from the shadows. Leave before it's too late. Maggie's blood ran cold. Her body froze in place. She looked around, her eyes wild with panic. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with their oppressive presence. The fire outside, the smoke, the shadows in the corner of her eye, all of it blended into a nightmare that felt all too real. Who's there? Maggie demanded, her voice cracking. She stepped forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. For a moment there was only silence. Then the voice came again, clearer now, its tone twisted with malice. You should have never come back. A shiver ran down Maggie's spine as her eyes scanned the room. She could feel the presence, something cold, something ancient, lingering just beyond her vision. She turned to Jake, her face pale with fear. Jake, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Stay close to me. Don't let go. But Jake wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the corner of the room, his face contorted in terror. There, he whispered. He's there, Mom, right behind you. Maggie turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. In the corner she saw him, the man. His face was burned, his skin blackened and peeling, as though he had been consumed by the flames. His eyes were dark and hollow, staring at her with an unblinking gaze. He stood motionless, just watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. No, this isn't real. But it was real. It was real, and it was standing right there in the shadows of the cabin. The man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Maggie's legs felt like lead, but she couldn't move. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was rooted to the spot, her body frozen with fear. The man's mouth opened, and the sound that came from him wasn't a voice at all. It was a screech, a high-pitched wail that seemed to pierce the very air itself. It echoed through the cabin, reverberating in her bones. Then everything went dark. When Maggie woke, the fire was gone. The cabin was quiet. The air smelled fresh, clean, free of smoke. She sat up slowly, her head spinning. She was still in the cabin, still on the floor where she had collapsed. But the man, the burning man, was gone. Jake was beside her, holding her hand, his face pale but calm. Mom, he whispered. We're okay. We made it out. Maggie looked around, confused. The sky was no longer orange. The fire was nowhere to be seen. It was as if everything had returned to normal. But as she looked down at her son, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On his arm, just below the sleeve, there was a faint, charred handprint burned into his skin, and she realized, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that they hadn't escaped the fire. It had followed them. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The smoke hung heavy in the air, a thick cloud that swallowed the sun, turning the sky into a sickly shade of orange. From the window of the small cabin in the woods, the only thing visible was the swirling smoke and the faint outline of distant flames licking the edge of the forest. Nora had never seen a wildfire this close before. The air was so dry and hot that it felt like she was breathing in fire itself. She had moved here to escape the noise of the city and the chaos of work, the constant pressure of daily life. She wanted peace, solitude, and time to heal. But now, as the world around her burned, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Her phone had long lost signal. There was no way to reach anyone. Her neighbors, if there were any nearby, hadn't been heard from for days. It was just her and the flickering shadows of the fire, stretching and shrinking like ghosts, twisting in the heat. Nora had never been superstitious, but there was something about the fire that unsettled her. It wasn't just the roar of the flames or the crackling of the trees as they burned. There was something else, something deeper. She had lived alone in remote places before, but she had never felt like this. It was as if the land itself was alive, watching her, waiting. She tried to push the feeling away, to focus on the reality of the situation. She needed to stay calm, find a way out, before the fire reached her cabin. The sound of a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was strange, considering she hadn't seen anyone for miles. No one had come by the cabin for months, not even hikers. And yet, there was the distinct sound of knocking again, a sharp, hurried rap that echoed through the stillness. Nora stood frozen, heart racing. Was it someone from the nearby town, a fellow evacuee who had gotten lost? Or was it something else entirely? Slowly, she moved to the door, peering through the small window beside it. There was no one in sight. But the moment her gaze turned away, she heard it. A whisper, soft and low, like a voice carried on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but it felt close, as if the voice were just behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she swung the door open. The heat of the fire outside rushed in, but there was no one there, just the empty forest stretching out before her. The ground crackled underfoot, the dry leaves turning to ash. Nora stepped out onto the porch, her mind racing. Was it a hallucination? The smoke was thick, and she had been trapped in the cabin for days, breathing in the toxic air. But no, it felt real. The voice had been too clear, too real. She looked around, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No one. Only the fire, creeping closer with every passing minute. But as she turned to go back inside, she caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A figure. A shadow, barely visible through the smoke, moving slowly across the clearing. Nora's breath hitched in her throat. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend into the forest. It walked in a slow, deliberate manner, as if it were gliding across the ground, not disturbing the dirt or the air. Nora's first instinct was to call out to it, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she found herself frozen, staring at the shadowy form as it moved farther into the trees. The voice came again, louder this time, clearer, a whisper right behind her ear so close that it made her flinch. "Run," it said. "You don't belong here." Nora spun around, but there was no one. She was alone again, just the trees, the fire, and the oppressive smoke. She stood there for a long moment, her mind spinning. Should she run? Should she leave now, before the fire reached her? But the figure, it was so strange, so unnatural. It hadn't looked like a person, not entirely. The shape had been wrong, like it was a part of the forest itself, something that didn't belong to the world of the living. The fire roared in the distance, a reminder that she didn't have much time. But something told her to stay, to wait. The land felt wrong. She couldn't explain it, but every fiber of her being told her that if she left now, she might never return. That shadow, that voice, they were warnings. And there was something else, something deeper she couldn't yet understand. She turned back toward the cabin and froze. The door was open, just a crack, and from inside she could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. Someone was inside her cabin. Heart racing, Nora rushed back to the door, her hands trembling as she pushed it open. She expected to see a person, Maybe a stranger who had stumbled across the cabin, seeking refuge from the fire. But there was no one there. The cabin was empty, silent, save for the faint creaking of the wood as it settled. Everything was exactly as she had left it. But there was a presence. She could feel it, as if the walls themselves were watching her, breathing with the wind. She stepped cautiously inside, every sense alert, every muscle tensed. The smoke billowed in from the open door, and the flickering light from the fire painted the walls in an eerie orange glow. As her eyes adjusted, she saw something strange. The air in the middle of the room shimmered as if the temperature had dropped suddenly, causing the smoke to swirl and swirl in unnatural patterns. And then, in the center of the room, something appeared. A figure. This time it was clear. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, though his features were indistinct, blurred, as though he were made of smoke itself. He didn't seem to move, but his presence filled the space, pressing down on her. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It was him. The shadow in the forest. The same figure, the same form. But now it was here, in her cabin. It didn't speak, but Nora could feel it. The heaviness of its presence, the deep, hollow feeling that something was terribly wrong. The fire outside burned brighter now, its heat more intense, but the figure in the room didn't react. It didn't seem to care about the fire or the world outside. It was frozen, a specter from another time, existing between the spaces of reality and something else, something she didn't want to understand. "Why are you here?" Nora whispered, her voice trembling, but the figure didn't respond. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and she spun around, heart racing. The room was growing colder, the smoke thickening, and the fire outside seemed to retreat, leaving her in a strange, suffocating stillness. It was as if the world outside had disappeared entirely, and there was only the cabin, the figure, and her. The figure slowly began to move, a single step forward. His feet didn't touch the floor, floating just inches above it. His face was still a blur, but his presence was undeniable. "I didn't mean to intrude," Nora said, her voice small, her knees trembling beneath her. "Please, I didn't mean to." But the figure was already gone. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving behind nothing but the lingering chill and the thickening smoke. The fire outside raged louder than ever. Nora didn't wait another second. She grabbed her bag, shoved open the door, and ran into the night. The smoke wrapped around her, choking her, but she ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She didn't stop running until she found the road. It was dark now, but she could see the red glow of the fire just over the horizon, growing closer, faster. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away. The fire, the smoke, the figure, they were all too much, too real, too impossible. As she ran, she realized one thing. The land she had come to in search of peace was never meant for her. There was something in it, something ancient that wouldn't let her go, something that had been waiting for her, something that had followed her all along. Story the end.